The wind was a living thing. It was a predator that clawed at the log walls of the cabin, its voice a high, keening shriek that promised a death of ice and stillness. To Alara, it sounded like the souls of the damned, a chorus of all the things she had lost. She stood by the hearth, her hands outstretched not to the meager flames, but to the rough, cool stone of the chimney. The fire did little to fight the cold that seeped through the chinking, a deep and penetrating chill that had settled in her bones the day the world had gone dark. It had been 4 months since the wagon accident. 4 months since the splintering crack of an axle, the scream of her husband, Thomas, and the blinding, searing pain that had stolen the light from her world. The doctors in the distant town had been kind but useless. They had used long words that meant nothing, their voices thick with a pity she could not bear. They sent her back to the mountain with her son, Daniel, in a darkness that was as vast and unforgiving as the wilderness around her. Now, she was a widow, a blind widow, and Alistair Finch, the man whose poorly maintained freight wagon had caused the accident, the man who owned the bank, the town, and it seemed the very air they breathed, wanted her land. He saw a vulnerable woman, an easy mark. He did not see the iron that was slowly, painfully, forging in the furnace of her grief. Mama. Daniel's voice was small, a fragile birdsong against the gale. He was 6, all sharp angles and quiet movements, a boy who had learned to be silent in a house filled with sorrow. Alara turned, her face aimed toward the sound. She had learned to map the small cabin by memory and sound. 3 steps from the hearth to the rough-hewn table, 10 from the table to the door, 7 to the narrow cot where Daniel slept. "I'm here, my love," she said, her voice softer than she felt. The world was a tapestry of sounds and textures now. The whisper of Daniel's wool trousers as he shifted his weight, the rhythmic drip of melting frost from the eaves, the frantic gnawing of a mouse in the wall. These were her eyes. "The wind is angry," he whispered, his small hand finding hers. His fingers were cold. She squeezed them, wrapping them in the worn fabric of her apron. "It's just the storm, little bear. It can't get in a lie." It was already inside, in the chill of their bones, in the scarcity of their firewood, in the gnawing emptiness of their larder. Thomas had been a mountain. He had known how to read the sky, how to hunt, how to split wood with an effortless grace. Alara knew how to stitch a fine seam, play the piano she no longer owned, and read books she could no longer see. Her skills were ghosts, useless against the coming winter. Finch had visited last week. She had not seen his sneer, but she had heard it in his voice, a slick, condescending tone that made her skin crawl. He had spoken of her unfortunate situation and the burden of the land. He had offered a pittance, a sum that was an insult to Thomas's memory, to the sweat and blood he had poured into this homestead. He had called it a generous offer for her and the boy. The threat was unspoken but clear: take it, or he would take it anyway. He would foreclose, citing the debt he himself had manufactured after Thomas's death. She had refused. The word had felt like a stone in her throat, heavy and hard one. Fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in her belly, but defiance was a spark. A tiny, precious spark she nursed in the darkness. "This is my home," she had told him, her voice trembling but firm. "My husband built it." His laughter had been dry, like leaves skittering across pavement. "Your husband is dead, Mistress Caldwell, and this mountain has no place for a blind woman and a boy. It will devour you." Now, listening to the blizzard's full-throated rage, she feared he was right. The last of the salted pork was a meager sliver. The flour sack was limp and nearly empty. Daniel's cough had a rasping edge she did not like. Despair was a tide, and it was rising. A sudden, violent crash against the cabin door made them both jump. It was not the wind. It was a solid, heavy impact, a body hitting the wood with desperate force. Daniel yelped and scrambled behind her, his small hands clutching the back of her dress. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. Finch! He had sent his men. They had come to throw her out into the storm. The spark of defiance flickered, nearly extinguished by a wave of pure, animal panic. Another thud, weaker this time, followed by a low groan that was torn away by the wind. It did not sound like the aggressive confidence of Finch's thugs. It sounded like pain, like desperation. "Mama, what is it?" Daniel's voice was a muffled tremor against her back. Alara swallowed, her throat dry as dust. She took a shuffling step toward the door, one hand outstretched, her fingers finding the rough, splintered wood. The heavy bar Thomas had fitted across it was in place. They were safe. For now. But the sound, it was the sound of a creature in its death throes. Man or beast, she couldn't tell. She pressed her ear to the door, the cold of the wood a shock against her skin. Over the shriek of the storm, she heard it again. A ragged, guttural sound. A man's voice, choked with agony. It was not the voice of a predator. It was the voice of prey. Every instinct screamed at her to stay put, to guard her son, to protect the fragile shell of their safety. But Thomas had never been a man to let a creature suffer, and some part of him still lived in her. The thought of someone freezing to death on her doorstep, just feet from the warmth of her fire, was a horror she could not abide. It felt like a betrayal of everything this cabin, this life was supposed to be. "Stay by the fire, Daniel," she commanded, her voice gaining a sliver of authority. "Do not move from the hearth." She heard his hesitant retreat, the scuff of his worn boots on the floorboards. Her hands, clumsy with a mixture of fear and cold, fumbled for the heavy wooden bar. It was thick and heavy, designed to keep grizzlies out. It took all her strength to lift it from its brackets. The wood groaned in protest. With the bar down, the wind slammed against the door, which shuddered in its frame. The latch was frozen. She beat against it with the heel of her hand, the sharp impacts jarring up her arm. Finally, with a screech of tortured metal, it gave. The door flew open, torn from her grasp. The storm lunged into the cabin, a monster of wind and ice. It extinguished the lantern in a single, violent puff, plunging the room into a deeper gloom lit only by the dancing, inadequate firelight. Snow and freezing air swirled around her, stealing her breath. And there, slumped against the doorframe, was a shape, a mountain of a man, collapsing inward like a felled tree. He was enormous, far larger than Thomas had been, a hulking silhouette against the swirling white chaos of the blizzard. He slid down the frame and fell inward, landing with a heavy, sodden thud on the floorboards, bringing a drift of snow in with him. Alara slammed the door shut against the storm's fury, her body trembling with the effort. She fumbled for the bar, her numb fingers struggling to find the brackets. She heard the wood scrape into place and leaned against the door, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The cabin was filled with the smell of wet wool, cold pine, and something else. Something metallic and sharp. Blood. The man on her floor groaned again. A sound scraped raw from the depths of his chest. Alara's fear was a cold, sharp thing, but it was now mingled with a terrible, pressing sense of responsibility. She had let the storm in. She had let this danger, this unknown, into her home. "Daniel," she said, her voice shaking. "Bring me the other lantern." She crept forward, her hands held out in the darkness, until her knee bumped against the man's leg. It was as hard as a log. He was wearing thick trousers, soaked and freezing. Her questing fingers brushed against something leather, then something cold and hard. A pistol holstered at his hip. Terror, sharp and blinding, shot through her. This was no lost traveler. This was a gunman. One of Finch's, perhaps, sent to do his dirty work and caught in the storm he had expected to use as cover. Just then, Daniel was at her side, the second lantern held high. Its warm, yellow light pushed back the shadows, and for the first time, she wished she could see. She could feel Daniel's gasp, a sharp intake of breath that told her more than her own eyes ever could. "What is it, Daniel? What do you see?" she whispered, her hand resting on her son's shoulder, a gesture meant to comfort him that did more to steady herself. "He's big, Mama," Daniel breathed. Like a bear, there was a pause. "And he's bleeding." The man's head was a mass of dark, wet hair matted with snow and blood. A long, ugly gash ran from his temple down his cheek, stark and crimson against the pallor of his skin. His face, what Daniel could see of it, was covered in a thick, dark beard, and his skin was weathered and scarred, a roadmap of a hard life. He was dressed in buckskins and furs, clothes made for the wilderness, not for town. One of his arms was bent at an unnatural angle, and a dark stain was spreading rapidly across the shoulder of his deerskin jacket. Is he one of Mr. Finch's men?" Alara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel was quiet for a moment. He had seen the men Finch sent. They were loud and cruel, with shifty eyes and mean smirks. "I don't think so," he said finally. "He doesn't look like them. He looks sad." The man stirred, his head rolling to the side. A low growl rumbled in his chest, the sound of a cornered animal. His eyes fluttered open. Alara felt the change in the air, the sudden spike of consciousness. She felt Daniel flinch beside her. "What are his eyes like?" she asked softly. "They're gray," Daniel said, "like the sky before the snow." The man tried to push himself up, his one good arm trembling with the effort. A sharp hiss of pain escaped his lips. His gaze, Alara imagined, was sweeping the room, taking in the woman and child, the meager fire, the vulnerability of it all. "Who?" he rasped, his voice a gravelly ruin. "This is my home," Alara said, finding a sliver of strength. She rose to her feet, positioning herself between the stranger and her son. "You are bleeding on my floor." There was a long silence, broken only by the howl of the wind and the man's ragged breathing. She could feel his stare, could feel the weight of his assessment. He was a predator, she was certain of it, but one that was wounded, cornered. And that, she knew, was often the most dangerous kind. He made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a groan. "Apologies, ma'am," he grunted, and then his head fell back against the floorboards, and he was silent. Alara stood frozen, her world a storm of sound and fear. The wind shrieked its threats, the fire crackled its warnings, and the stranger's breathing was a shallow, faltering rhythm on her floor. She had a choice. She could drag him back outside, back into the blizzard's embrace, and bar the door behind him. It would be the safe choice, the sensible choice. Finch's words echoed in her mind. The mountain has no place for a blind woman and a boy. But another voice, deeper and older, the voice of her own humanity, whispered a different truth. To push him out would be to murder him. She knelt beside him, her decision made. Her fingers, hesitant at first, moved to the wet, cold fabric of his jacket. She had to see how badly he was hurt. As her hand touched his shoulder, the man's hand shot out, impossibly fast, and clamped around her wrist. His grip was like an iron manacle. She cried out, a sharp gasp of shock and pain. Daniel scrambled back with a cry of fear. The man's head lifted, his gray eyes, she imagined, boring into her. They were no longer dull. They were sharp, alert, and full of a feral intensity. He was not unconscious. He was playing possum, assessing them. "Don't," he rasped, the single word a clear and absolute threat. Alara went still, her breath caught in her throat. His fingers were like stone, crushing the delicate bones of her wrist. She could feel the pulse in his thumb, a slow, powerful beat against her own frantic, fluttering pulse. He was immensely strong, even wounded. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, forcing the words past the lump of fear in her throat. "You are hurt. The cold will kill you if the bleeding doesn't." He did not release her. He held her there, testing her, judging her. She could feel the tension in his arm, the coiled power of a man who lived by violence. She did not pull away. She forced her own hand to relax within his grasp, a gesture of submission, of trust she did not feel. "Let me help you," she whispered. "Please." For a long moment, the standoff held. The cabin was silent save for their breathing and the storm. Then, slowly, agonizingly, his fingers loosened. He did not let go entirely, but the crushing pressure eased. It was a concession, a truce. "The bullet is still in," he grated out, his voice tight with pain. "Shoulder. A bullet." So she had been right. This was not an accident. This man was hunted, or he was a hunter. It made little difference. Violence had followed him to her door. "Daniel," she said, her voice strained, "fetch the whiskey from your father's chest, and the sewing kit, and boil water. All of it. Now." The boy, galvanized by the command, scrambled to obey. Alara took a slow, deep breath, her wrist still loosely held in the stranger's grasp. She was in over her head, adrift in a sea of dangers she could not see. But for now there was only this: a wounded man, a raging storm, and a simple, terrifying task of keeping them all alive until morning. She gently pulled her wrist free. He let her go. "We have to get you out of these wet things," she said, her tone becoming practical, detached. It was the only way she could function. And closer to the fire. Getting him to the hearth was a monumental effort. He was a dead weight, a mountain of muscle and bone. He tried to help, pushing with his good leg, his jaw clenched against the pain that radiated from his shoulder. Alara pulled, her small frame straining, her boots slipping on the wet floor. Daniel, seeing their struggle, wedged his small body against the man's back and pushed with all his might. Together, they dragged him across the floorboards, an inch at a time, until he was lying on the worn bearskin rug before the fire. The warmth of the flames began to thaw him, and with the warmth came a deeper, more agonizing pain. He gritted his teeth, his breath hissing between them. Sweat beaded on his pale forehead, mingling with the melting snow. "The jacket," Alara said, her hands already fumbling with the leather ties. It was a struggle. The wet leather was stiff, and the angle was awkward. Finally, she had to resort to taking Thomas's hunting knife from its peg on the wall. The feel of the familiar handle in her hand was a small comfort. "I'm going to cut it," she warned him. A low grunt was his only reply. She sawed at the thick deerskin, her movements careful but firm. The sounds guided her, the rasp of the blade against the leather, the man's sharp intake of breath as she jostled his arm. She cut up the sleeve and across the back, peeling the ruined garment away from his torso. The air filled with the coppery stench of fresh blood. His shirt beneath was a sodden, crimson rag. "Daniel, more light," she ordered, her voice tight. She needed the boy's eyes. She began to gently tear the cloth away from the wound. The man went rigid, his whole body tensing like a drawn bowstring. A guttural sound of agony was torn from his throat. "Hold still," she commanded, her own fear making her sharp. "I have to see it." "It's bad, Mama," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. "It's all red, and there's a hole." Alara's fingers, sensitive and sure, explored the edges of the wound. The skin was torn and puckered. The flesh beneath was hot and swollen. Deeper, her fingertip brushed against something hard and small. The bullet. It was lodged against the bone. She had seen Thomas tend to livestock with similar injuries. She had never worked on a man. "The whiskey," she said, holding out a hand. Daniel pressed the bottle into it. She uncorked it, the sharp scent stinging her nostrils. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice flat. "More than anything has ever hurt before." "You need something to bite on?" She felt around, her hand finding a small piece of firewood. She pushed it toward his mouth. "Take it." She felt him hesitate, then the scrape of his teeth on the wood. She took the knife, its blade freshly cleaned. She poured a liberal amount of whiskey over the steel, the alcohol evaporating in the heat of the fire. She did the same to the wound. The man screamed. It was not a human sound. It was a raw, primal roar of pure agony that seemed to shake the very logs of the cabin. He thrashed, his powerful body convulsing, but he did not, or could not, move his injured arm. The piece of wood in his mouth splintered under the pressure of his jaw. Alara did not flinch. She could not afford to. "Daniel, hold his other arm." "Hold it down," she yelled over the man's cries. The boy, pale and terrified, threw his small weight across the stranger's good arm, clinging to it like a burr. "I have to get the bullet," she told the man, her voice loud and clear over his pain. "Do you understand? It has to come out." A choked, gurgling sound was his only answer. Taking that as consent, she took a deep breath, steadied her hand, and began to cut. It was a nightmare of sound and sensation. The slick slide of the knife into flesh. The man's strangled groans. The hot, sticky feel of blood coating her hands, her arms. The sickening scrape of the knife tip against bone. She worked by feel alone, her world narrowed to this one horrific task. The man's pain was a palpable thing in the room, a living entity that clawed at her, but she walled it off, building a fortress of concentration around herself. She probed with the tip of the knife, trying to dislodge the lead slug. It was wedged tight. The man bucked beneath her, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. "Almost," she muttered, as much to herself as to him. "Almost there." With a final, desperate pry, she felt it move. The small piece of metal, misshapen and warm, came free. It fell onto the floor with a small, wet click. The man went limp, his body slumping into the rug. His head lolled to the side, and the splintered piece of wood fell from his slack jaw. He was unconscious, or close to it. Alara felt a wave of nausea and dizziness wash over her. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. She was covered in his blood. But the worst was over. "Water," she croaked. Daniel, his face streaked with tears, brought her the steaming kettle. She cleaned the wound as best she could, her touch now gentle. Then she took the needle and gut thread from her sewing kit. Her hands, which had once stitched delicate embroidery, now began the crude work of sewing a man's flesh back together. Each stitch was a small prayer, each not a ward against the infection she knew was their next great enemy. When she was finished, she bandaged the wound with strips torn from one of her few clean petticoats. She washed the blood from her hands and arms, the water turning a murky pink. She felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion settle over her, heavier than any physical labor she had ever known. She sent a trembling Daniel back to his cot, pulling the blankets up to his chin. He was asleep almost instantly, his small face pale in the firelight. Alara sat on the floor by the hearth, watching the stranger. His breathing was deep, and even now, the breathing of sleep, not of unconsciousness. In the quiet, with the storm still raging outside, the cabin felt impossibly small, crowded with the presence of this huge, dangerous man she had just saved. She did not know his name. She did not know who had shot him or why. She only knew that his life was now tethered to hers, his fate tangled with her own. By saving him, she had invited the violence of his world into the fragile sanctuary of hers. She had barred the door against the storm, only to bring a hurricane inside. And as she listened to the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing, she wondered if she had just made the worst mistake of her life. The blizzard howled for 2 more days, a relentless siege of white fury that sealed them in the cabin as surely as a tomb. The world outside ceased to exist, replaced by the disorienting whiteout and the constant, deafening roar of the wind. Inside, a strange, tense quiet settled. It was a silence measured in the stranger's ragged breaths, the crackle of the fire, and the frantic beating of Alara's own heart. He drifted in and out of a fevered sleep. During his waking moments, he said nothing. He would simply lie on the bearskin rug, his gray, eyes open and watchful, tracking her movements as she navigated the small space. Alara learned the geography of his gaze. She could feel it on her, a physical pressure, as she moved from the hearth to the table, as she tended to Daniel, as she kneaded their last bit of flour into a thin, tasteless dough. He was an apex predator brought to ground, wounded but still lethal, and his stillness was more unnerving than any threat. She tended to his wound with a detached efficiency, changing the dressing, cleaning it with the last of the whiskey. His skin was hot to the touch, the fever clinging to him. He accepted her care without comment, his jaw tight, his body rigid beneath her hands. The only sounds he made were the low grunts of pain he could not suppress. Daniel was her shadow, his fear a palpable thing. He gave the stranger a wide berth, his eyes large and round as he watched the huge man by the fire. "Is he going to die, Mama?" he'd whispered once, his voice full of a child's morbid curiosity. "I don't know," Alara had answered honestly, her hands continuing their rhythmic kneading of the dough. "I'm doing what I can." On the 3rd morning, she woke to a different kind of silence. The wind had died. Its absence was a physical void, a sudden lack of pressure that made the cabin feel vast and empty. The stranger was awake. She could hear the subtle shift in his breathing, the quiet alertness that had replaced the shallow respirations of fevered sleep. "The fever's broken," he said. His voice was still a low rumble, but the raw, ragged edge was gone. It was the first full sentence he had spoken since he had arrived. Alara was stirring a thin porridge of ground corn over the fire. She didn't turn. "I know. I felt it when I changed the dressing this morning." She could feel his gaze on her back. "You have a surgeon's touch," he stated. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation. "I've tended to injured livestock," she replied, her tone clipped. "The principle is the same." She heard him shift, the rustle of the bearskin, followed by a sharp hiss of pain. He was trying to sit up. She turned toward the sound, her hands automatically going to her apron. "You should lie still. You lost a lot of blood. You're weak." "I've been weaker," he rasped. She heard a grunt of effort, and then the sound of his back thumping against the stone of the hearth. He had managed it. She ladled some of the thin gruel into a wooden bowl and moved toward him. She did not need to see to know where he was. His presence filled that side of the room. She held the bowl out in the space she knew he occupied. A large, calloused hand, surprisingly gentle, took it from her. His fingers brushed against hers, and the contact was like a spark of lightning. His skin was rough, scarred, the hand of a man who worked with rock and wooden steel. He ate in silence, the scrape of the spoon against the bowl the only sound. When he was finished, he held the bowl out for her. "My name is Silas," he said. The words were offered up like a carefully considered payment. "Alara," she replied, taking the bowl. "And my son, Daniel." "You're blind," he stated. Another observation, not a question. "Not always," she said, her throat tightening. She turned away, busying herself with the washing of the bowl. She did not want to talk about it. She did not want his pity. "The man who owns this valley, Finch," Silas said, his voice low and hard. "He's the one who did this to you." Alara froze, her hands submerged in the basin of cool water. "How could he know?" "What do you know of Alistair Finch?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "I know he hires men who are careless with their aim," Silas rumbled. "And I know he's trying to choke every last homesteader out of these mountains. I was tracking a catamount that was preying on a settler's goats down valley. Finch's men mistook me for a squatter on land, he claims. They shot me from a distance. Like cowards. So that was it. A case of mistaken identity had brought this whirlwind of a man to her door. He was not one of Finch's men, but he was Finch's enemy. And in this valley, the enemy of her enemy was a dangerous thing to have under her roof. "He wants this land," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My husband, Thomas, there was an accident. Finch's wagon. Thomas is gone. And my sight with him." The silence that followed was heavy, weighted with understanding. Silas did not offer condolences or empty platitudes. He simply absorbed the information, his silence a strange sort of comfort. It was the silence of the mountains, vast and non-judgmental. Later that day, the pivotal moment came. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it shifted the foundation of their fragile coexistence. Alara was trying to split the last of the firewood inside the cabin, a task that was both difficult and dangerous for her. The axe was heavy, and judging the distance and angle was a terrifying gamble. She had already nicked the floorboards twice. She swung the axe, a clumsy, hesitant blow, and it glanced off the side of the log, skittering dangerously close to her leg. She cried out and dropped the handle, stumbling back, her heart pounding. Before she could register what was happening, Silas was there. He had moved with a swift, surprising silence for such a large man. She heard the soft scuff of his boots, felt the warmth of his body as he stood beside her. He did not speak. He simply reached down and took the axe from the floor. Then his large hand gently closed over her own, guiding it to the top of the log she had been trying to split. "Feel the grain," he said, his voice a low murmur near her ear. His other hand guided hers along the rough bark to the top of the round. "It wants to split here, where you feel the small ridge." His hand was warm and rough over hers, his touch steady and sure. He placed her fingers on a tiny, almost imperceptible line in the wood. That's its weakness, he said. He took her hand away and placed it on the axe handle, which he still held. Now you know where to aim. He let go. Alara stood there, her hand on the familiar wood of the handle, the memory of his touch lingering on her skin. She could feel the tiny ridge in the log with the toe of her boot. She lifted the axe, her movements less hesitant now. She pictured the line he had shown her, a map in her mind's eye. She swung. The blade bit deep into the wood with a satisfying thunk, sinking right along the grain line. It didn't split clean through, but it was a perfect strike. A small smile touched her lips, the first genuine smile in months. It felt foreign, like stretching a muscle long and used. She had done it. From his place back by the fire, Silas said nothing. But she knew he had seen. It was not an act of pity. It was an act of teaching, of empowering. It was a quiet acknowledgement that her blindness was a condition, not a definition. In that single, gentle act, he had offered her not help, but respect. The fear she held for him did not vanish, but it changed. The sharp edges softened, replaced by a cautious, burgeoning curiosity. The apex predator had shown a moment of unexpected tenderness, and it broke through her fear in a way no words could have. That night, as Daniel slept soundly, a new quiet settled between them. The tension had eased, replaced by something more complex. It was the quiet of two solitary souls sharing a small pocket of warmth against the vast, indifferent cold. "Why are you here?" Alara asked softly, her voice aimed at the fire. "In these mountains, I mean. Alone." Silas was quiet for a long time, the only sound the shifting of his weight against the hearthstones. "Civilization," he finally said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth, "is a place where men like Finch thrive. They use laws and money like traps. They smile while they bleed you dry. I found more honesty in a grizzly's growl." He told her of a life before the mountains, a life in a crowded, dirty city to the east. He spoke of betrayal, of a partner who had stolen everything and a corrupt judge who had laughed in his face. He had lost his business, his name, his faith in the world of men. So he had walked away from it all, seeking a place where a man was judged not by the coin in his pocket, but by his ability to survive. He had come to the mountains to be alone, to live by a simpler, harsher code. He had found solitude, but he had not found peace. His voice was a low, gravelly monotone, devoid of self-pity. He was stating facts, laying out the scars on his past as plainly as the scars on his skin. When he was finished, the silence returned, deeper this time. Alara felt a strange kinship with this wounded giant. He, too, was a survivor of a world that had chewed him up and spit him out. "My father taught me to play the piano," she said, her own voice quiet and distant. "My hands, they knew the keys better than they knew my own face. When Thomas and I moved up here, we couldn't afford to bring it. He promised me one day he'd buy me another, the finest one in the territory." She ran a hand over the rough, callous skin of her other palm. "Now, these hands can't even tell a C-sharp from a B-flat, but they can feel the grain in a log. They can find a bullet in a man's shoulder. They can feel my son's face in the dark." She told him about her life with Thomas, about their dream of building a ranch, a home, a legacy in this wild, beautiful place. She spoke of the day of the accident, not of the pain or the fear, but of the sudden, shocking silence after the crash, and the terrifying realization that the light was gone forever. It was the first time she had spoken of it to anyone, the first time she had given voice to the full scope of her loss. Sharing their histories was like lancing a wound. The poison of their solitude drained away, leaving them raw and vulnerable, but clean. In the shared darkness of the cabin, surrounded by the immense, snow-covered silence of the mountains, two broken people began to piece themselves together. Over the next few days, a domestic rhythm established itself. Silas, still weak, but regaining his strength with a feral tenacity, refused to remain idle. He could not swing an axe, but he could show Alara how to do it properly, his voice a low guide as she worked. He taught her how to feel the tension in the wood, how to use her body's weight instead of just her arm strength. The woodpile grew steadily. He also turned his attention to Daniel. He saw the boy watching him, a mixture of fear and fascination in his eyes. One afternoon, while Alara was outside, Silas took out his hunting knife, a formidable piece of steel, and a small block of pine. Daniel shrank back, but Silas did not look at him. He simply began to carve. With slow, deliberate movements of his good hand, he shaved away slivers of wood. A shape began to emerge. It was a wolf, its head thrown back in a silent howl. He worked with an intense, quiet focus, and the boy crept closer, mesmerized. When it was finished, Silas held it out to him. The small wooden wolf was perfect, its fur detailed with tiny nicks of the knife, its form full of life and energy. Daniel looked from the carving to the big, scarred man, and for the first time, his fear was entirely replaced by awe. He took the wolf, his small fingers tracing its form. "Thank you," he whispered. Silas just grunted, a flicker of something unreadable in his gray eyes. When Alara came back inside, she found her son sitting by the hearth, close to the stranger, moving the small wooden wolf through imaginary snowdrifts on the bearskin rug. The bond was forged. From that day on, Daniel was Silas's constant companion, chattering away to the silent man who would listen for hours, occasionally offering a one-word answer or a low rumble of acknowledgement. He was teaching the boy how to tie knots, how to read animal tracks in the dusting of snow near the door, how to listen to the language of the forest. Alara found herself watching them, a strange warmth spreading through her chest. The cabin, which had been a vessel of grief and fear, was starting to feel like a home again. It was filled with new sounds, Daniel's laughter, the scrape of Silas's knife on wood, the steady, rhythmic thud of the axe as she worked. A sense of partnership began to grow between them, unspoken but solid. They were a team, a strange, broken little family, united against the wilderness outside and the threat they knew was coming. The peace was shattered a week after the blizzard broke. The snow had melted enough to make the trail passable again, and Alara had known it was only a matter of time. The sound came first, the jingle of harnesses and the low, guttural laughter of cruel men. It was a sound that made the hair on Alara's arms stand up. She was outside, splitting the last of a large pine round, the axe feeling more and more like an extension of her own body. Silas was near the tree line, his injured arm in a sling he'd fashioned from a strip of leather, checking a series of snares he'd set for rabbits. Daniel was inside. "Alara." Silas's voice was a low, urgent warning from the trees. "Go inside. Get the boy. Bar the door." She didn't hesitate. She dropped the axe and ran for the cabin, her movements sure and swift across the familiar ground. She burst through the door, her heart hammering. Daniel, away from the window. "Now!" She slammed the heavy door shut just as three riders crested the small ridge that overlooked the cabin. She fumbled for the bar, her hands shaking, and slid it into place. The sound of it locking home was a small, defiant boom. "Who is it, Mama?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with fear. "Finch's men," she said, her back pressed against the door. She could hear their horses approaching, the crunch of the snow under their hooves. Well, look what we have here," a sneering voice called from outside. It was a man named Brody, Finch's foreman, a man with a soul as rotten as a dead log. "The little widow is still playing homesteader. Mr. Finch is tired of waiting, ma'am. He sent us to collect his property." Alara's blood ran cold. This was it. They had come to evict her. But where was Silas? She strained her ears, listening for him, but there was only the sound of the horses and the men's coarse voices. "You're trespassing," she called out, her voice trembling but loud. "This is my land." Brody laughed, a nasty, sharp sound. "Not for long. Now, you can open this door and walk out with your boy, or we can burn it down around you. Your choice." Fear, cold and absolute, threatened to paralyze her. They would do it. She had no doubt. She thought of Daniel, of the fire, of the all-consuming terror of being trapped in a burning building she could not see her way out of. Her hand went to the bar. Maybe it was better to surrender, to walk away with their lives. Then she heard it. A voice, low and cold as a mountain stream in winter, came from the direction of the woods. "I'd rethink that course of action if I were you." Alara's breath caught. Silas. She heard Brody curse. Who the hell is that? Step away from the cabin, Silas's voice commanded. It held no hint of negotiation. It was the voice of a man giving an order he fully expected to be obeyed. Leave the woman and the boy alone. And who are you to be giving orders? Another man sneered. Some half-dead squatter? We thought we took care of you last week. There was a moment of silence. Alara pressed her ear to the door, her entire being focused on the drama unfolding outside. Your aim is poor, Silas stated calmly, and your judgment is worse. This is your only warning. Mount your horses and ride out of this valley. If you ever come back to this cabin, I will not be so merciful. Brody laughed again, but this time it had a brittle, uncertain edge. There's 3 of us and 1 of you, old man, and you look to be favoring an arm. There are 3 of you, Silas's voice agreed, and it seemed to come from a slightly different place now, closer. But only 1 of me is holding a rifle, and I can put a bullet through a running deer's eye at 200 yards. A fat, stationary target like you, Brody, is no challenge at all. Now, which one of you wants to see if I'm bluffing? The silence that followed was thick with tension. Alara could picture it. The 3 mounted men, suddenly unsure of themselves, scanning the deep shadows of the forest for a man they could not see. A man they knew was a brutally efficient hunter. The hunter had become the hunted. She heard the nervous shuffle of a horse, the creak of saddle leather. This ain't over, Brody snarled, his voice tight with humiliation and rage. Finch will hear about this. He'll send more men. An army if he has to. You just signed your own death warrant, squatter. And the widows, too. Get out, Silas said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. The command was obeyed. Alara heard the sound of the horses being spurred into a hasty retreat, their hooves churning up the snow as they galloped away. She waited until the sound had faded completely, leaving only the quiet whisper of the wind in the pines. She sagged against the door, weak with relief. She lifted the bar and pulled it open. Silas was standing 20 yards away at the edge of the forest. He held Thomas's old rifle in his one good hand, its stock resting easily against his hip. He looked like a vengeful spirit of the mountain, a figure of myth, his face grim, his gray eyes as hard and cold as granite. He walked toward her, his long strides eating up the distance. He didn't stop until he was standing before her in the doorway. He looked past her, his gaze sweeping the interior of the cabin, checking on Daniel, who was peeking out from behind the table. They'll be back, he said, his voice flat. He wasn't lying. Finch is a man of wounded pride. He won't let this stand. He'll send more men. 12, maybe more. He'll want to make an example of us. Alara looked up toward the sound of his voice, her own face pale but resolute. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but the spark of defiance, which had so nearly been extinguished, was now burning bright and hot. They had threatened her son. They had threatened to burn her home. They had crossed the line. Then we'll be ready for them, she said, and the voice that spoke was not the voice of a frightened victim. It was the voice of a woman who had found something to fight for. You said yourself, my husband built this cabin to keep grizzlies out. The walls are thick. There's only 1 door and 2 windows. We can defend this place. Silas looked down at her, a flicker of surprise in his stony expression. He saw the change in her, the iron in her spine, the fire in her words. He had expected to see fear, and he did. But it was tempered with a fierce, protective resolve that matched his own. It'll be a fight, he warned her. A bloody one. I'm not afraid of blood, she replied, her voice quiet but unwavering. You taught me that. A slow, grim smile touched Silas's lips. It was a terrifying sight, the smile of a wolf before a battle. All right, Alara, he said, the sound of her name in his rough voice a strange sort of vow. Let's get ready for a war. The days that followed were a blur of grim preparation. The cabin, once a sanctuary of grief, transformed into a fortress. The air, once thick with sorrow, now crackled with a tense, focused energy. War had been declared, and their small, isolated homestead was to be the battlefield. Silas was the general, his mind a sharp, tactical map of their surroundings. Despite the sling that still cradled his wounded arm, He moved with a relentless purpose. His protective fury, which had been a controlled, simmering threat when he confronted Brody's men, was now channeled into a cold, methodical fortification of their home. "The windows are our weakness," he declared on the first day of their preparations. He had Elara guide him to the two small, square openings. He ran his good hand over the frames, testing the wood, the glass. They'll try to shoot through them, or break them to get a clear shot inside. Together, they boarded them up from the inside. They used the thick planks from the small and used shed where Thomas had stored his tools. Alara's job was to hold the heavy boards in place while Silas, with his one good arm, painstakingly hammered the long, iron nails into the log walls. The cabin was plunged into a near-total darkness, lit only by the constant fire and the flickering lanterns. It became a cave, a den. The sound of the hammer blows echoed in the enclosed space, each one a nail in the coffin of their peaceful life, each one a defiant shout against the coming darkness. They reinforced the door, adding a second, heavier bar. Silas showed Elara how to wedge a heavy log against it at an angle, using the floor as a brace. "Even if they break the bars, they won't get through this easily," he explained, his voice a low rumble in the gloom. "It will buy us time." Their world shrank to the confines of the cabin and the small, cleared area around it. They worked from dawn until dusk, a silent, efficient team. Alara's hands, once soft, were now calloused and strong. She hauled water, stacked the growing woodpile with a desperate urgency, and prepared their meager meals. Her heightened senses became an asset. She could hear the subtle change in the sound of a nail being driven home, telling her it was secure. She could feel the stability of a stack of logs, knowing it would not tumble. She was no longer just surviving in her darkness. She was learning to master it. The most crucial part of their preparation came on the third day. Silas retrieved the second firearm from Thomas's belongings, a small, light shotgun, a fowling piece. He laid it on the table next to his own rifle. "You need to learn how to use this," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Alara's hands recoiled from the cold metal, as if burned. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't see. How can I possibly shoot a gun?" The idea was ludicrous, terrifying. "You don't need to see," Silas countered, his voice patient but firm. "You need to listen, and you need to feel." He picked up the shotgun and placed it in her hands. It was lighter than the rifle, its balance different. "Your world is sound and memory, Elara. We're going to use that." He spent hours with her. In the dim, fire-lit cabin, he made her memorize the feel of the weapon, the smooth, worn stock against her cheek, the cold, precise click of the hammers, the weight of the shells in her palm. He made her load and unload it in the dark, over and over, until her fingers moved with a clumsy but growing confidence. Then came the training. He made her stand in the center of the room, the shotgun held at the ready. Daniel was sent outside to the woodpile, told to stay put and be silent. "Close your eyes," Silas commanded, though the command was redundant. "Now listen." He moved silently around the cabin. He would tap a wall. "Where am I?" he'd ask. "To the left of the door." She'd answer, her head turning to follow the sound. He'd scrape a boot on the floorboards near the hearth. "Now, by the fire. To your right." He did this for an hour, making the sound softer, subtler. The rustle of cloth, the soft clearing of a throat. Her hearing, already sharpened by her blindness, became preternaturally acute. She began to build a map of the room in her mind, a map made of echoes and vibrations. "Good," he said finally. "Now, when you hear a sound, you don't aim at it. You become a part of the gun. You point your whole body. The gun is just the end of your finger." He stood behind her, his large frame a warm, solid presence at her back. He adjusted her stance, his good hand on her shoulder, the other guiding the barrel of the shotgun. "Feel the balance. This is your space. You know every inch of it. The door is 10 paces that way. The window on the left is 8 paces. The hearth is behind you. Anyone who comes through that door who isn't me or Daniel is the enemy. You hear a footstep where it shouldn't be, you point, and you pull the trigger. You don't hesitate. You don't think. You react." He was teaching her to be a killer. The thought made her stomach churn. But then she thought of Finch's sneering voice, of Brody's threat to burn them alive. She thought of Daniel's small, frightened face. The churning in her stomach settled into a cold, hard knot of resolve. She would do what she had to do. The shotgun spreads, he explained. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be pointed in the right direction. At this range, in this room, it will be devastating. He gave her one of the precious few shells they had. This is just for practice, he said. He had her load the weapon. He then went to the far side of the cabin and hung an old, empty grain sack from a peg. That sack is a man, he said, his voice cold. He just broke down your door. He's coming for your son. What do you do? Alara's heart pounded. She could hear the rustle of the sack as it swayed slightly. She raised the shotgun, the stock pressed hard against her shoulder, her cheek welded to the wood, just as he had shown her. She took a breath, pictured the man, pictured Brody's leering face. She pointed her body toward the sound, toward the memory of where Silas had hung the sack, and she pulled both triggers. The roar was deafening in the enclosed space. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, a brutal, jarring impact that knocked her back a step. The cabin filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. For a moment, there was a ringing silence. You hit it, Silas said, his voice holding a note of grim satisfaction. You tore it to shreds. Alara stood trembling, the heavy gun suddenly feeling like it was made of lead. She had done it. A wave of both horror and fierce, terrible pride washed over her. She was no longer just a victim waiting for the wolves. She was a hunter sharpening her claws. As the day of the inevitable attack drew closer, the tension in the cabin became a living thing. They spoke little, their communication reduced to the essentials. But a new kind of intimacy grew in the silence. It was the intimacy of soldiers before a battle, a bond forged in shared purpose and mortal danger. She would catch the scent of him, pine smoke, leather, and a faint, masculine musk, as he passed her in the cramped space, and it was no longer a scent of fear, but one of reassurance. He was the rock, the mountain against which the storm would break. One evening, after Daniel was asleep, they sat by the fire, cleaning the weapons. The silence stretched, comfortable and deep. You should take the boy and go, Silas said suddenly, his voice low. He did not look at her, his attention focused on oiling the action of his rifle. When they come, I can hold them off. Give you a head start. You can head north over the pass. There's a settlement a few days' walk from there. You could be safe. Alara stopped her own work, her hand still on the smooth wood of the shotgun stock. The offer hung in the air between them. It was a sacrifice. He was offering to trade his life for theirs. A month ago, she would have taken it without a second thought. No, she said, her voice quiet but absolute. He finally looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face in the firelight, as if he could see into the darkness of her own eyes. Alara, they're not coming here to talk. They're coming to kill, to wipe this place off the map. There is no shame in running. This is my home, she said, her voice fierce. Thomas is buried on that hill. Our dreams are in the logs of this cabin. My son was born in that bed. If I run now, I'm running for the rest of my life. Finch will have one. He will have taken everything. I will not let him have the satisfaction. She paused, her grip tightening on the shotgun. Besides, she added, a grim smile touching her lips, where would you go? The question hit him like a physical blow. Where would he go? Back to his solitude? Back to a life of lonely survival? He looked around the small, dark cabin. He looked at the sleeping boy, at the fierce, determined woman before him. In this place of imminent death, he had found the one thing he had not even known he was looking for. A purpose, a home, a family. To protect them was no longer a duty. It was a visceral, absolute need. He said nothing. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. The offer had been made and rejected. They were in this together, to the end. He picked up the oil rag and went back to his work, but the simple action was an answer in itself. He was not leaving. He was staying to fight. The attack came 2 days later, at dusk. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, the air still and cold. A raven cried a single, lonely call from a distant pine, and then there was silence. A heavy, expectant silence. "They're here," Silas said. He was standing near one of the boarded-up windows, peering through a tiny crack he had left for observation. "I count 10 of them, maybe more in the trees. Brody is leading them." Alara's blood went cold. 10. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. She reached for the shotgun, its weight both a burden and a comfort. She moved to her assigned position, near the center of the room, her back to the hearth. Daniel was huddled beneath his cot, a thick quilt pulled over him. He had been instructed not to make a sound, no matter what he heard. "Remember what I taught you," Silas said, his voice a low, calming rumble. He moved to his own position beside the door, his rifle resting on the top of the barrel. "Don't shoot until they're inside. Let them come to us. This cabin is our killing ground." The first sound was a shout from outside. "Caldwell, Silas, whoever you are, Finch has a message for you. He's tripled the offer for the land. Take it and walk away, and he'll forget any of this ever happened." It was Brody's voice, slick with false reason. Silas didn't answer. The silence from the cabin was more unnerving than any shouted defiance. "Have it your way," Brody roared, his frustration boiling over. A gunshot cracked, the bullet thudding harmlessly into the thick log wall. And then the assault began. It was chaos. A volley of gunfire erupted, bullets hammering against the cabin like a deadly hailstorm. Splinters flew from the boarded-up windows. The noise was deafening, a constant, rolling thunder of violence. Alara flinched with every impact, her knuckles white on the stock of her shotgun. Then came the heavy, rhythmic thud of a ram against the door. They were trying to break it down. Thud, thud, thud. The whole cabin seemed to shake with each impact. The wooden bars groaned, the door shuddering in its frame. "Steady," Silas murmured, his voice impossibly calm amidst the din. "Let them waste their energy." The ramming continued, punctuated by sporadic gunfire. Alara could hear the men shouting outside, their voices coarse and excited, like dogs closing in on a kill. She focused on her breathing, on the feel of the gun in her hands, on the map of the room in her mind. With a final, splintering crash, the top bar broke. The door sagged inward. Another slam, and the second bar splintered, throwing shards of wood into the room. The door flew open, torn from its hinges, and crashed to the floor. For a heartbeat, there was silence. The doorway was a gaping black mouth, silhouetted against the dying gray light. Then the first man charged through, a shadowy figure holding a pistol. Silas's rifle cracked once, a sound like a thunderclap in the small room. The man jerked backward as if hit by an invisible fist and fell out of the doorway, gone. Another man tried to follow, but hesitated at the sight of his fallen comrade. It was a fatal mistake. Silas's rifle cracked again. The second man crumpled in the doorway, blocking it. "He's by the door," a voice screamed from outside. "Rush him." 2 men charged in at once, stumbling over the body of their companion. They were shadows, shapes of violence. One fired wildly, the bullet burying itself in the ceiling. The other raised his pistol toward Silas. This was Alara's moment. The sound of the intruders was clear to her left. A footstep, a shouted curse. It was a sound that did not belong. She pivoted, the shotgun coming up as if it had a will of its own. She didn't aim. She pointed. She became the gun. She pulled the triggers. The blast was a physical force, a roar that shook her to her bones. The man who had been aiming at Silas was lifted off his feet and thrown backward, his chest a shredded ruin. He landed in a heap on top of the other intruder, who screamed and scrambled back out the door. "She's got a scattergun," he shrieked, his voice choked with terror. In the ringing silence that followed, Silas spoke, his voice low and tight. "Good shot, Alara." He was already reloading, his movements economical and swift. The initial assault was broken. The henchmen were no longer so eager to charge into the dark, deadly maw of the cabin. They fell back, taking cover, their confidence shattered. But it was far from over. A new sound reached them, the tinkle of breaking glass. They were smashing the boarded-up windows. A gun barrel was shoved through a hole in the planks on the west wall. It fired blindly into the room. Alara heard the bullet tear through the wall near Daniel's cot. A primal fear, cold and sharp, cut through her. Silas must have heard it too. He abandoned his post by the door, crossed the room in 2 long strides, and fired his rifle point blank through the wooden planks. A scream from outside told him he'd found his mark. Then came the smell. Smoke. "They're trying to burn us out," Silas snarled, his voice a low growl. He moved to the opposite window, where flickering orange light was beginning to lick through the cracks in the boards. They had piled brush against the wall and set it ablaze. The sanctuary was being violated, destroyed. The fire grew with terrifying speed, the crackle of the flames a hungry, devouring sound. Smoke began to fill the cabin, thick and choking. Daniel started to cough, a small, terrified sound from under the cot. Panic, hot and blinding, seized Alara. They were trapped. They would be burned alive or forced out into the guns of Finch's men. "The roof," Silas yelled, his voice cutting through her fear. He pointed upward. "The sod roof is damp. It won't catch easily, but the walls will. We have to go out." Go out? Into that whirlwind of bullets? It was suicide. "Trust me," he said. He grabbed a heavy blanket from her bed, doused it with their precious drinking water, and threw it over her head and shoulders. "Stay low. Follow me. When we go, we don't stop." He went to Daniel, pulled the terrified, coughing boy from under the bed, and wrapped him in another wet blanket. "Hold on tight, son," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He settled the boy on his hip, holding him with his good arm. He picked up his rifle with his wounded one, his face a mask of pain and determination. "Now," he roared. He charged out the door, a great, roaring bear of a man, with the boy tucked against his side. Alara was right behind him, her head down, the shotgun clutched in her hands, her world a terrifying chaos of sound and smoke. Gunfire erupted from all sides. She heard the whip crack of bullets passing close to her head. She could hear Silas yelling a primal battle cry as he fired the rifle from his hip. She stumbled, her foot catching on the body in the doorway, but she did not fall. She followed the sound of Silas's boots, the sound of his voice, her only guide in the pandemonium. They cleared the cabin just as the flames took hold of the doorframe. The night air was cold on her face, but the heat from the burning wall was intense. She could hear men shouting, moving, trying to get a clear shot. "This way," Silas yelled, pulling her toward the cover of the forest. A figure loomed up in front of them. Brody. He had a pistol leveled at Silas's chest. "It's over, squatter," he sneered, his face illuminated by the firelight. Silas couldn't bring his rifle to bear in time. He shielded Daniel with his body. Alara reacted on pure instinct. The shape of the man, the sound of his voice, it was a target. She raised the shotgun, which she had managed to reload in the smoky cabin by feel alone. She fired. The blast caught Brody square in the chest. His sneer vanished, replaced by a look of utter shock. He staggered back, dropped his pistol, and fell to his knees before collapsing into the snow. But their path was blocked by another figure, a man in a fine wool coat, his face pale and contorted with rage in the flickering light of the burning cabin. Alistair Finch. He had been watching from a safe distance, but the death of his foreman had drawn him out. In his hand, he held a small, ornate derringer, and it was pointed not at the formidable Silas, but at her. "You," Finch spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "You blind bitch. You did this. This is all your fault." He was a physical coward, but his wounded pride had driven him to a dangerous, desperate place. He saw his power, his authority, being defied and destroyed by the one person he considered weakest. Silas started to move toward him, but Finch just waved the small pistol at Alara. "Stay back, or I'll shoot her right now." Alara stood frozen. The man who had destroyed her life was just feet away. She could smell the expensive cologne he wore, a sickeningly sweet scent amidst the smoke and blood. She could hear his frantic, shallow breathing. He was going to kill her. The thought was strangely calm, distant. Then she thought of Daniel, safe for the moment with Silas. She thought of Thomas and the home they had built. She thought of the axe handle in her hands, the shotgun stock against her cheek. She was not the same woman Finch had tried to intimidate weeks ago. The mountain had remade her. The fire had forged her. She did the last thing he expected. She took a step toward him. "You took my husband," she said, her voice low and cold as the grave. "You took my sight. You will not take my home." He faltered, surprised by her defiance. His eyes darted from her to Silas, who was slowly, deliberately circling to the side. Finch was trapped between the avenging angel and the wounded grizzly. "Stay back," he shrieked, his voice cracking. He raised the derringer, his hand shaking violently. Alara didn't stop. She took another step. She was empty-handed now, having dropped the shotgun after firing it. She was defenseless, but her advance was relentless. It was then that Daniel, from the safety of Silas's arms, let out a terrified cry. "Mama!" The sound broke the spell. It was the final catalyst. Finch, his nerves shattering completely, turned his pistol toward the sound of the boy's voice. It was a mistake born of pure, cowardly malice. In that split second, as his aim shifted, Alara lunged. She was not aiming for the gun. She was not aiming for his head. She dove for his legs, her body low to the ground, a blind tackle fueled by a mother's desperation. Her shoulders slammed into his knees. The wealthy, powerful land baron, who had never known a moment of real physical hardship, went down with a surprised squawk. He landed hard, the back of his head hitting the frozen, unforgiving ground with a sickening crack. The derringer flew from his grasp, landing somewhere in the snow. Alara lay on top of him, panting, the smell of his fear thick in the air. He was silent. Still. Too still. The remaining henchmen, seeing their leader fall and their foreman killed, lost what little courage they had left. They melted back into the darkness of the trees, their retreat a panicked scramble of fleeing cowards. The battle was over. The silence that descended was profound. It was broken only by the hungry crackle of the fire as it consumed the cabin, and the soft, ragged sound of Alara's own breathing. Silas was at her side in an instant. He gently pulled her up, his hand warm and steady on her arm. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. "No," she whispered, her body trembling with adrenaline. "Is Daniel?" "He's safe," Silas said. "He's right here." He shifted the boy in his arms, and Daniel's small hand reached out, finding Alara's face. "Mama," he sobbed, his fingers tracing her features as if to be sure it was really her. "The house is on fire." "I know, my love," she whispered, her hand covering his. "It's all right. We're safe now." She turned her face toward the man on the ground. "Finch." Silas knelt, his fingers searching for a pulse at Finch's neck. He was silent for a moment. "He's gone," he said, his voice flat. "He hit his head on a rock when he fell. A final, ignominious end for the civilized tyrant. Not by a bullet or a blade, but by his own cowardly fall." There was a grim justice in it. They stood there for a long time, the three of them, a strange, battle-scarred family, illuminated by the funeral pyre of their home. The fire roared, casting dancing shadows against the snow, consuming their past. Everything they had owned was turning to ash. But they were alive, they were together, and they were free. The aftermath was a landscape of quiet devastation. The rising sun cast a pale, watercolor wash across the snow, revealing the grim tableau of the night's battle. The bodies of Finch and his men lay like discarded dolls in the pristine white, stark reminders of the violence that had visited their mountain. The cabin was a blackened, smoldering skeleton, a gaping wound in the landscape. Thin wisps of smoke rose from the charred logs, carrying the last of their old life away on the cold morning air. They had survived the night in the small, tool shed that had been spared the flames. It was cramped and cold, but it was shelter. Daniel, exhausted by terror, had fallen into a deep sleep, curled between them under a pile of horse blankets scavenged from Finch's dead mounts. As the light grew, Silas moved with a grim, methodical purpose. He dealt with the bodies, dragging them one by one to a shallow ravine far from the homestead. It was a brutal, necessary task, and he did it alone, shielding Alara and the boy from the worst of it. He was a man accustomed to the harsh realities of death in the wilderness. He treated the dead with a detached respect, a final closing of the book. When he was done, he scrubbed the blood from his hands with snow until they were raw. Alara, meanwhile, sifted through the ruins of her home. The heat was still intense in places, but at the edges, she could feel her way through the debris. Her hands, covered in soot, searched for anything salvageable. Very little had survived. The iron cookstove was warped but intact. A handful of cast iron pots were blackened but usable. Everything else, their clothes, the bedding, the few books Thomas had treasured, the small wooden toys he had carved for Daniel, was gone. It was a total loss. She stood in the center of what had been her living room, the charred floorboards crunching under her boots. This was the spot where she had nursed her son, where she had laughed with her husband, where she had faced down her fear. Now it was just ash. A profound, hollow emptiness opened up inside her. They had won the battle, but it felt as though they had lost the war. Silas came to stand beside her, his large frame blocking the morning sun. He smelled of smoke, cold air, and grim labor. He said nothing, simply stood there, his presence a silent anchor in her sea of loss. "It's all gone," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Everything, not everything," he said, his voice a low rumble. He reached out, his calloused, soot-stained fingers gently touching her cheek. His touch was hesitant, almost reverent. "You're here. The boy is here. That's not nothing." His simple words, his gentle touch, broke through the dam of her control. A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the soot on her face. She did not sob. It was a quiet, deep grief, a final letting go of the past. By midday, a visitor arrived. It was the sheriff from the nearest town, a man named Gable, accompanied by a single deputy. They rode in cautiously, their eyes taking in the smoldering ruins and the signs of a fierce battle. Gable was one of the few lawmen in the territory whom Finch hadn't owned. He was an older man, weathered and tired, but with honest eyes. Silas met them, his rifle held loosely in his good arm. He explained what had happened, his account terse and factual, omitting none of the bloody details. He told them where to find the bodies. Sheriff Gable listened, his expression grim. He looked from the giant, scarred man to the blind woman standing proudly amidst the ruins of her home, her son clinging to her skirts. He had known of Finch's predatory tactics for years, but had been powerless to stop them. "Alistair Finch pushed too far this time," Gable said, his voice heavy. He looked at the devastation. "This looks like self-defense to me. A clear case of it. He brought a private army to your home. You did what you had to do." He sighed, his gaze lingering on the ruins. "There will be paperwork, questions from the territorial marshal. But Finch had many enemies and few friends. I'll file my report. As far as the law is concerned, this matter is closed." He offered to take them back to town, to find them a place at the church. Alara politely refused. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and strong. "But our place is here." Gable looked at her, at the unwavering resolve in her soot-stained face, and he understood. He nodded, a look of deep respect in his eyes. "Godspeed, ma'am," he said, and tipping his hat, he and his deputy rode away, leaving them once again to the silence of the mountains. With the immediate threat gone and their actions legally sanctioned, a new reality began to set in. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and an uncertain future. They had a temporary shelter, a handful of supplies scavenged from the attacker's saddlebags, and the wild game Silas could snare. But winter was setting in for good. They could not survive in a shed. That evening, they sat around a fire built in the open, the stars cold and brilliant in the black sky. The ruins of the cabin stood behind them, a dark, skeletal shape. The crossroads had been reached. The battle was won. His duty, as he saw it, was done. Silas stared into the flames, his face a stoic mask, but Alara could feel the shift in him. The focused warrior's energy was gone. replaced by the old, familiar restlessness of the loner. He had protected them. He had fulfilled the unspoken pact between them. Now, the world was calling him back to his solitude. "The pass will be snowed in soon," he said, his voice quiet. "I should leave in the morning." The words struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. She had known they were coming, had dreaded them, but hearing them spoken aloud was still a shock. The thought of him leaving, of facing this desolate future with just Daniel, was an agony she had not anticipated. The cabin had felt like home because he was in it. He had become a part of its foundation. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral, betraying none of the panic churning inside her. "North," he said vaguely, "deeper into the mountains. There are places men like Finch have never seen." He was retreating back into his wildness, back into the safety of being alone. This was the moment of truth. The old Alara, the grieving, frightened woman he had first met, would have pleaded with him to stay, would have begged for his protection. But she was not that woman anymore. She had faced down killers. She had defended her son. She had taken a life to protect her own. She was his equal. She rose to her feet and turned to face him, a silhouette against the starry sky. "You could," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You could go back to your lonely life. You could spend the rest of your days with no one but the wind for company." Or she paused, taking a breath, "You could stay." Silas looked up at her, his gray eyes luminous in the firelight. He saw no pleading in her stance, no desperation. He saw strength. He saw a partner making an offer. "Stay for what, Alara?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. "To live in a shed? To watch you and the boy starve? I am a hunter, a drifter. I have nothing to offer you." "You have everything to offer," she countered, her voice ringing with a passion that startled them both. "You have your strength. You have your knowledge of this mountain. And I have mine." She held up her hands, palms out. They were no longer the hands of a pianist or a seamstress. They were the hands of a survivor. "These hands can't see, Silas, but they can build. My father was a carpenter. He taught me about joints and trusses, about foundations and frames. Thomas and I, we drew up plans. Plans for a bigger house, for a barn, for a whole ranch. I have them all memorized. Every beam, every nail." She took a step closer, her voice dropping, becoming intimate, persuasive. "Don't you see? You're the mountain, Silas. You have its strength, its resilience. But I have the design. Together, we could rebuild. Not just this cabin, but everything. A real ranch. The finest ranch in this valley. A place where a boy can grow up safe. A place where a man can finally find a home." The plea, when it came, was not a plea for help, but a plea for a shared future. "I don't want to protect her, Silas," she said, her voice trembling with the force of her conviction. "I want a partner. I don't want you to save me. I want you to build with me. Stay. Stay and build a life with me. With us." He stared at her, stunned into silence. For his entire adult life, he had defined himself by what he was not. He was not a city dweller, not a businessman, not a part of society. He was a creature of the wilderness, a solitary soul. He had never considered what he could be. He looked at her, this fierce, incredible woman who saw not a savage, but a foundation. He looked at the sleeping boy who had carved a space in his heart with a small wooden wolf. He had fled civilization to escape its corruption, but in doing so, he had also fled connection, love, a future. He had thought home was a place you left. Alara was showing him that home was a thing you built. Slowly, he rose to his feet. He was a giant of a man, scarred and dangerous, a remnant of a wilder time. He stood before her, the woman who had saved his life, the woman he had taught to kill, the woman who was now offering him a world. He reached out, his hand cupping her jaw, his thumb gently tracing the line of her cheekbone. "Alara," he said, his voice thick with a lifetime of unspoken loneliness. And then he leaned down and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, earth-shattering tenderness. It was a kiss of acceptance, of homecoming. It was the silent, solemn vow of a man who had finally found his true north. In the ruins of a life lost, against the backdrop of a harsh, an unforgiving wilderness, they chose to build a new one together. The first snows of winter fell in earnest the next day, a soft, thick blanket that covered the scars of the battle and the ashes of the old cabin, making the world clean and new. For Silas and Alara, it was not an ending, but a beginning. The decision to stay had settled in Silas's soul, a deep and quiet certainty that felt more real than anything he had ever known. The restless spirit that had driven him for years was finally still. Their first task was survival. The shed was too small, too cold. With the snow falling, they worked with a desperate, unified energy. Silas, using his recovered strength, began felling young, straight pines from the thick woods bordering their land. The sound of his axe echoed in the crisp air, a powerful, life-affirming rhythm. Alara, her hands protected by rough leather gloves, limbed the fallen trees, her movements sure and economical. She could feel the shape of each branch, the place where it joined the trunk, and she worked with a speed that would have been astonishing for a sighted person. They were rebuilding the cabin, but on a grander scale, following the plan she held in her head. She was the architect, he was the laborer. She would describe the kind of joint needed, a saddle notch or a dovetail, and guide his hands with her own, her sensitive fingers tracing the lines on the wood. He learned to trust her vision, her memory, her uncanny sense of space and form. People in the valley had laughed at the idea of the blind widow. They could not imagine the world she saw with her hands. Daniel, freed from the terror of the siege, became a boy again. He helped, carrying small pieces of wood, gathering pine boughs for insulation, his chatter filling the silence. He orbited Silas, mimicking his movements, his admiration for the big man shining in his eyes. Silas, in turn, treated the boy with a gruff, unwavering affection. He was no longer just the boy's protector. He was becoming his father. They lived a hard, primitive existence for those first few weeks. They cooked their meager meals over the open fire, the taste of smoke in everything. They slept huddled together for warmth in the cramped shed. But there was no despair. The shared labor, the common goal, forged them into a seamless unit. They were building more than a house. They were building a family. One afternoon, as Silas was hoisting a massive ridgepole into place, Alara stood below, calling out directions. A little to the left, Silas. You feel notch I cut. It needs to sit flush, he grunted, muscles straining, and shifted the enormous log. It settled into place with a satisfying thud. He looked down at her, her face tilted up toward him, her expression one of intense concentration. A dusting of snow was on her hair, and her cheeks were red from the cold. He was struck, not for the first time, by her beauty, a fierce, resilient beauty that outshone any conventional prettiness. This was his woman. This was his home. As the walls rose, so did their hopes. The structure was larger and more solid than the first cabin. The logs were fitted with a precision born of her design and his strength. It was a fortress, yes, but it was also a home built not just of wood and stone, but of shared trust and a stubborn refusal to be broken. When the four walls were up and the roof structure was in place, they paused. It was a milestone. That evening, sitting by the fire, Silas reached into a saddlebag he had taken from Finch's horse. He pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger and a pouch heavy with coins. It was Finch's account book and his personal money. A substantial sum. This is yours, Silas said, placing it in her lap. By right of conquest, I figure. It's enough to buy supplies. Glass for the windows. A new stove. Maybe even some cattle come spring. Alara ran her hands over the smooth leather, the cold, hard coins. This was the wealth of the man who had tried to destroy her. It was a bitter irony, but it was also a tool. It's ours, she corrected him gently. We'll use it to build our ranch. The final image of their new beginning was simple. The main structure of the cabin was complete, sealed against the worst of the winter. A proper hearth of river stone, built by their four hands, radiated a deep, steady warmth. Daniel was asleep in a newly built bunk, the little wooden wolf clutched in his hand. Alara stood by the hearth, her hands outstretched to the wonderful, permeating heat. Silas came to stand behind her, wrapping his powerful arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into his strength, his solidity. He was her rock, her mountain. The finest ranch in the valley, he murmured into her hair, his voice a low, contented rumble. "We're not there yet," she whispered, a smile in her voice. "We still need a barn, and fences, and livestock. We'll build them," he said, his voice full of a quiet, unshakable confidence. Together, he turned her in his arms, his scarred, rugged face close to hers. He did not need to see her eyes to know what was in her heart. He could feel it in the way she leaned into him, in the way her hands came up to rest on his chest. He lowered his head and kissed her, a deep, possessive kiss full of promise for the endless seasons to come. The fire crackled, the wind howled softly outside, and in the heart of the wild, unforgiving mountains, a family, forged in darkness and fire, had finally found its home. They had faced the darkness together, a blind widow and a broken man, and from the ashes of their past, they had built a future. Their story would become a quiet legend in the valley, a testament to the fact that true strength is not the absence of weakness, but the courage to build in spite of it. And that love, like the hardiest mountain pine, can find a way to grow in the most unforgiving of places.